Hey everyone, welcome to the debrief. Mike will be joining us in just a second. Today we're talking about the vincible ignorance of Catholic leaders, and then will Pope Francis approve new SSPX bishops? We have a new story on Carmelite nuns in Texas taking on their bishop, and we'll wrap with tensions and conflicts among Catholics in the month of June. All of this on the debrief. Welcome to the Debrief, the weekly show where we're talking about news, questions, and controversies facing the Catholic Church. I'm Dominic Souza, the founder of Smart Catholics.
And I'm Mike Lewis, the founder and editor-in-chief of Where Peter Is.
Let's dive into something that you just published, this morning, Mike. You wrote an article on Where Peter Is called Vincible Ignorance Begets Invincible Ignorance. Can you why did you write this article? What are the use of these words?
Well, the genesis of the article, as you know, at Where Peter Is, we take a lot of these accusations, these assumptions, these claims that are made against Pope Francis. A lot of them are unfounded. A lot of them are based on misinterpretations, misunderstandings. The other day, actually last week, we talked about the topic of personhood and how Pope Francis, in trying to discuss the issue of abortion, tries, and he said many times, this is not a religious issue. This is a human rights issue. It's a human issue. It's a basic moral issue. And one of the things when dialoguing with secular humanists or people who have who disagree with the Catholic Church's teaching, will try to argue that that a developing embryo or fetus, or even an infant in some cases, is not a person. Pope Francis, in the Telemundo interview, as we discussed last week, said, I'm not saying person. I'm saying it is a living thing. It's a living being. It's a human life, and it needs to be protected. He's always been very clear that from the moment of conception, it's a life and we need to protect it. And let's just put aside this personhood argument. Well, then it turned out this week, we discussed it on the debrief. We reshared the article when the exact same controversy popped up last year. I shared it a few times, but some outspoken critics of Pope Francis, Eric Sammons, who's the editor of Crisis Magazine, and Deacon Keith Fournier, who is in the Diocese of Tyler, Texas, and is kind of the right-hand man. Some people say the brains behind Bishop Strickland. Both tweeted that the Pope's answer was unclear. It could be troubling. It could be suggesting that he doesn't believe that that the human life should be protected from the moment of conception. Deacon Fournier actually quoted from the Catechism, which we discussed, which said that that Catholics, that we should regard, or that we should treat the embryo or the zygote as a person from the moment of conception. But it's not really a dogmatic definition. And obviously it's not, Thomas Aquinas had different ideas of when ensoulment happens, and, there's some biological questions, but it felt quite repetitive to see something that had already been addressed, something that had already been explained, something that had been debunked. Pope Francis's reasoning was given clearly. It's because he's speaking to people who don't necessarily accept the Catholic Church's view of personhood. And I just thought to myself, these are smart men. Deacon Keith Fournier, he's an attorney, he's a writer. He heads up, I believe, a catechetical institute for Bishop Strickland. Eric Sammons has been a Catholic writer and editor for a long time. He edits a magazine Walker Percy once wrote for Crisis Magazine. I don't know if he's rolling in his grave right now, to see that this kind of information is coming out. But one thing that really struck me was that why are they should know better.
Mm-hmm.
If they're going to make an accusation against the Pope, why are they resurrecting something that had been already debunked last year? It's actually, in terms of bioethics, it's been something that the Catholic Church has discussed and clarified for decades.
Mm-hmm.
I also, when Peter Kwasniewski, who we mentioned last week, had decided to participate in the Hope is Fuel conference, he withdrew from the conference. And he gave a very, very nuanced and clearly delineated reasoning for his dropping out. And it was that as a public intellectual, he felt it would be inappropriate for him to appear at a conference alongside a sedevacantist. The host, Patrick Coffin, is a sedevacantist.
Mm-hmm.
But otherwise, other people can, will probably benefit from this conference. And on the matter of E. Michael Jones and his anti-Semitism, Dr. Kwasniewski basically said, I'm not terribly aware of what he has said or written about the Jewish people. I'm vaguely aware that he has conspiracy theories. I was shown some content that disgusted me, but he didn't go any further than that. He didn't, it's like, why did he refrain
Mm-hmm.
from informing himself about the views of E. Michael Jones, especially since, as I wrote in my article, all you need to do is watch 2 videos of him. One isn't even on YouTube because it's him denying the Holocaust on an Iranian television station. The other one is actually on YouTube.
Wow.
Where he says, the fact is the Jews killed Christ and they are the enemies of the human race. And that's in the first 10 minutes of the video, of the 45-minute video, where he goes on to talk about, the evils of Judaism, how they have a revolutionary spirit, how they've caused secularization, immorality. They've, everything from modern architecture to rock and roll music is the Jews are behind it. Meanwhile, every 5 minutes during this interview, he's arguing that he's not anti-Semitic. But I mean, the thing is, it's like, why would somebody who's as influential as Peter Kwasniewski, who has an audience, who has a platform, why would he restrict, or why would he withhold private views and not inform himself, first of all, before agreeing to participate in the conference? And he actually admits the reason why he signed up was because of what he described as the hysteria from liberal Catholics. But it also drew to mind other things. I constantly see where Peter is accused of having Mormon ecclesiology, or thinking the Pope is a wizard or an oracle, or blindly obeying everything that the Pope says, or saying, and the word utterance I rarely hear, but in the past 7 or 8 years, it's not every utterance of the Pope is infallible, and it's like, I do know that. If you read the website, you would know this information. And what I've noticed is that a lot of these people, these leaders, I hear their talking points echoed by anonymous trolls, non-anonymous, good-willed Catholics who are in our parishes, who are on social media, maybe people who don't have the wherewithal or the time, or haven't dedicated themselves to to researching and investigating questions having to do with the Catholic faith. And so that's the basic idea, is that vincible ignorance begets invincible ignorance.
So is there a difference between like intentional and Vincible, or
Okay,
what's
yeah,
the...
sorry, I don't know if I've defined the term. So invincible ignorance. From basically what the Catechism says is the Church recognizes that ignorance can reduce someone's culpability for a sin or an error, but only when the ignorance is invincible. That is, when the moral subject is not responsible for his erroneous judgment. Sometimes it can be intelligence. Sometimes it's just not having the tools or the education or the wherewithal to look up accurate information. Some people, when the internet was new, they would have that aunt who would forward, everyone on her email list some bizarre conspiracy theory. People have different levels of discernment, different levels of discretion. But if you posit yourself as a teacher or an educator or a public intellectual on the Catholic faith, you have a responsibility to learn the other side of the story. It's the whole thing. If you can repeat your opponent's argument back to them, that's a sign that you really understand your issue. But one thing that I constantly see from traditionalists is they create these cartoon caricatures of Pope Francis and the people who defend them. They call them modernists and leftists and Marxists and hyper papalists. And then but they don't actually define the terms, define them to mean anybody that actually exists. And so, I mean, it's something that I guess is wearing on me after 5 years at where Peter is. We've always made a point of citing our sources. I link back to Peter Kwasniewski's statements so that people can click and read them in full context. I'm presenting you with my argument. I'm presenting you with as much information as possible. I'm citing it. When I'm citing the Catechism, I'm linking, I'm providing the paragraph number. And that's a service that we do to for our readers because we're interested in truth. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the case with this reactionary group. And the thing that I've found interacting with trolls, interacting with, random people at my parish who might say something like Pope Francis is pro-abortion or something like that, or he rejects the Catholic faith, or he's not the true Pope. I don't sense the reasoning ability necessarily. They don't really know their arguments. They can't really articulate them, but their opinions are entrenched. So who's responsible for entrenching these ideas in their heads? It's these public figures. It's Catholic media. So anyway, I basically spilled my guts about that issue. So
it's an intense article. Check the links in the description, friends, and give it a read. So Mike, how do you think the different types of ignorance are harming the Catholic Church and the greater society? And maybe you've just literally answered that, but
I think it's just that false narratives begin to take hold. One that I brought up that simply will not break is this rumor, or this slander, I guess is a better term, that in October 2019, a group of indigenous Catholics from the Amazon region participated in a pagan ceremony or performed pagan worship during a tree planting service on the feast of St. Francis. It's a lie. The figure was not Pachamama, as it has been called. These people were not idolaters. They were Catholics. They were praying to the Christian God in the way they know how. It has been debunked. Every single argument, every single claim,
minute of the experience has been scrubbed through. Yeah.
Pedro Gabriel has done it. I've done it. Some traditionalists have even done it. Michael Lofton posted a video that, interestingly, changed some minds, but it's like these arguments are there. It is a groundless, false, and I'm going to say it again, racist lie that
Wow.
they were
Yeah.
pagans and that it was a pagan ceremony. And yet the invincible ignorance of these people who are capable of
Mhm.
learning the truth, if they were willing to just
Wait, you
listen
mean
to the
the
arguments.
vincible ignorance? The
The Vincible, yeah. Well, I'm
Yeah,
saying the leaders that
right.
propagate
The ones
these
who should know.
ideas,
Yeah.
people who should know. And
Mhm.
unfortunately, those whose faculties or their time to look into things, or simply their level of trust in
Mhm.
various people that they grant authority to,
Yeah.
create invincible ignorance. Now, there's
Mhm.
a third kind of ignorance, which isn't really ignorance at all, and it's even
Mhm.
worse. I would describe what it is as feigned ignorance. The Catechism
Oh,
says,
I see.
feigned ignorance and hardness of heart do not diminish, but rather increase the voluntary character of a sin. The example I used in the article, or one of the examples I used that demonstrated this, was um, an article I wrote probably 3 years ago called "The Inanity of Control F Criticism," and it
I remember that one.
was based on a video of Taylor Marshall, where
Yeah.
he says, "There's nothing about God, there's nothing about Jesus in this entire encyclical Fratelli Tutti." And then he puts up three terms: Jesus Christ, God the Father, and the Holy Spirit. And there's one occurrence of Jesus Christ. There are two occurrences of God the Father, or none, and there's one of the Holy Spirit. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was
Yeah.
minuscule. And he said,
Mhm.
look at this. And he had gone through the control F function. Well, if you looked for Father with a capital F, there were something like 19 references to it. There were like 30 references to Jesus, another 10 to Christ, another
Mhm.
one to Christ Jesus,
Mhm.
but only
Okay.
one or two to Jesus Christ. Spirit, there were quite a few examples of that as well. Holy Spirit, if you only put the in front of it, as he did in his graphic,
Mhm.
then there were fewer examples. I mean, it was a dirty trick, and
Yeah.
there's no
And
way
so
he
that's
could
that level of
divulge.
like feigned discussion
Exactly.
or umbrage. Okay.
So anyway, I could go on about this for days, but
Well,
I mean, it's sort
let's
of, yeah.
let's
Move us
move on
on.
to the next. We want to cover this tweet, and I'm kind of curious which level of ignorance maybe this falls under. But the Society of St. Pius X named an apologist named Jeff Kasman. He tweeted an extremely well-placed source, and maybe you can bring up the tweet for those who are watching on YouTube.
Yeah.
It says multiple priests of the SSPX will be consecrated in June with permission from Pope Francis. Is it Davide? Davide is
Davide.
among the likely candidates. Is there any truth? Like, how should we think about a tweet like this?
Okay, first of all, no, it's not going to happen. There is a 0% chance that this will happen. Don Davide
Cool. Let's
would
move on.
would be he's the he replaced Bishop Fillet as the
Mhm.
superior of the SSPX. And it's funny because Fillet, who is a pretty strong radical traditionalist, and was one of the original four bishops ordained by Bishop Lefebvre back in 1988. He's pretty extreme in his views, but Father Davide, represents the more hardline group. Um, doesn't favor reconciliation with Rome.
Mhm.
Um, People are asking why they would float a rumor like this, and I've heard a
Yeah.
few theories. One of which is, and as we've discussed, we've been looking at a lot more SSPX apologias recently. People trying to
Mhm.
justify their status, saying that they have official approval from Rome, saying that the excommunications were invalid. My guess is they're maybe floating this rumor so that if they do perform more illicit ordinations or episcopal consecrations, they can say once again, the Vatican pulled out or was dragging their feet at the last minute, Or, another thing that pops into my mind is if you read SSPX apologetics, or if you listen to them, they use very hollow arguments. People will bring up apostolic letters, official statements, documents, where John Paul II or Pope Francis will say that they are in schism. They'll use the word schism, but then they'll say, oh, well, this random retired bishop said that Pope Francis told him that the SSPX isn't in schism. So that proves that they're not in schism. And that, once again, it's, I think this is feigned ignorance rather than vincible ignorance. I think that they're just taking any shred of proof that, or I wouldn't even say proof, evidence that they have approval from the institutional church to justify their existence. Now, the crazy thing is they intersperse their supposed official approval from the Pope with accusations that the Pope is a heretic and a modernist and embraces Freemason ideology, and that the Novus Ordo is an abomination.
All the good stuff.
It's ridiculous. But no, it is not going to happen. You can rest assured that Pope Francis will not bless or grant approval to this.
Yeah.
Next question.
All right. We had an just weird and intriguing bit of news that came out of a conflict. So reports of a conflict between a group of cloistered Carmelite nuns and Bishop Michael Olson of the Diocese of Fort Worth. I had not heard of this until you mentioned it right before our recording here. So what is going on?
Well, it's a really odd story, and I've got to wonder, why is it always the Carmelites? It's because where Peter is. We had Sister Gabriella talking about the different conflicts that were going on within different Carmelite nuns, but once again, so this story sort of came across the news, and it's been updated, but it's sort of had these twists and turns. So this is the Diocese of Fort Worth in Texas, and there is a Carmel, a monastery of cloistered Carmelite nuns in Arlington, Texas, that falls within the diocese, where the prioress, Mother Teresa Agnes, apparently she had surgery, and she's had a feeding tube, and she's had a wheelchair, or she's been in a wheelchair. And I don't know if this was prior to the surgery or what, but apparently, and this is the nuns, at least the nuns' version of the story, was that when she was groggy and still under the influence of anesthesia, she confessed, not in confession, but admitted to a violation of the sixth commandment with a priest from outside the diocese. I don't know if he was a spiritual director or was giving a retreat. I don't know if she was in the wheelchair at the time or needed the feeding tube at the time that this supposedly occurred. The sisters are arguing that, she wasn't in her right mind when she said it. It never happened. But Bishop Michael Olson believes it's true. So he began an investigation of the order beginning in April. And we'll link the story to give all the details. But then the nuns decided, well, for one thing, they said, we are a pontifical right order. We report to the Pope. We don't report to the local bishop. So you can't, invade our territory or try to boss us around. So I guess he tried to continue with this investigation, and they wound up filing a lawsuit against him. So this is pretty odd, nuns suing their bishop, so suing the local bishop. I don't even know how the First Amendment and U.S. Religious laws would handle something like that. Well, in retaliation, the bishop then Bishop Olson decided to withdraw their access to daily mass. They did have daily mass on Sundays, they had Sunday mass. They still had access to Sunday mass, withdrew their access to the sacrament of reconciliation, with the exception of, the church's requirement, which is once a year, and shut down their. I guess a lot of people were attending mass in the monastery, just would go to daily mass or would go to Sunday mass there, and he restricted them. Anyway, this is sort of where we're staying now. All of the press coverage on this has been from the sisters' point of view. Bishop Olson, the Diocese of Fort Worth, hasn't put forth anything other than like the official decrees, at least that I've seen. So anyway, the latest development was yesterday when the Vatican's dicastery on religious and consecrated life, people call it, well, it used to be sickle cell was how they would pronounce the acronym. Now I guess it's Dickle Cell.
It's not helping either.
But Dickle Cell issued a document basically ordering an investigation of the monastery, and they designated Bishop Olson as the investigator.
Okay.
And on top of that, they removed any, they sanated or any defects, any canonical things that he may have done that might have been violations of canon law up to that point. And immediately thereafter, he dismissed Reverend Mother from her position, from the Carmelite order, due to these alleged violations of the sixth commandment. And that's the latest news. That's where we are.
And she's still denying it.
She's still denying it. The order is still denying it. It seems draconian. It seems bizarre
weird
on the surface.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, the only justification that I can imagine for this kind of treatment is if the bishop has information that's not being shared publicly that confirms for him that this violation of the sixth commandment did happen, but that's not available to the public. I mean, I don't know. I want to think back to Bishop Olson, however. It was probably about a decade ago. There was a small college within his diocese called Fisher Moore College, named after Saints John Fisher and St. Thomas More. And interestingly, a newly Catholic Taylor Marshall was the president of the college, if I recall correctly. And sorry. And he and so this it was small. It was like 30 students, 3 faculty members. I think it was adjacent to the University of Dallas, and maybe there was some crossover so that students could get credits done, but it was in its very early stages, but it was beginning to show some signs of radical traditionalist tendencies. And this was before Marshall himself was a radical traditionalist, but ultimately Bishop Olson wound up withdrawing the traditional Latin Mass from their parish, started overseeing the speakers that were invited. Like, I believe they invited Father Nicholas Gruner, who was a suspended priest, who's known as the Fatima priest, but he's always promoting, he passed away, but he was always promoting conspiracy theories like, Sister
Fourth
Lucia
secret.
having a body double and the fourth secret and, all those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So in the end, even though he wasn't very forthcoming with the information at the time, after all of these events happened, he was vindicated, or it was clear that he was doing the right thing. We don't, just like, I've said in the past, I don't have that information. That's my imagination thinking, like, how could this possibly make any sense? How could this be justified? Because the story in the media, it seems like this bizarre situation where a nun in a wheelchair is being punished for a groggy semi-confession of an unspecified violation of her vows. And, that's all we know. So anyway, we'll link to the story, and if there are any updates or if somebody decides to write about it for where Peter is, you can look into it yourself. But it's an interesting saga, and it's
Well, I appreciate you
Yeah.
shedding that weigh in or weighing in on Bishop Olson and that little bit of it has passed. I didn't know that, so that's it's good, I think, to step away from just jumping to conclusions or having too strong an opinion, because we don't know everything. All right. Lastly, we're now in the month of June. Catholics traditionally express devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, but in the general culture, it's also celebrated as Pride Month, recognizing and supporting the LGBTQ community. Where do you want to go with this one? Like, how do Catholics?
Yeah.
Where should we orient ourselves with this? Because online Catholic Twitter is just, it's a thing. So where do you want to go with this one?
Well, thanks for leaving me like that.
Well, hey, this is your debrief.
Honestly, Mike. Yeah, no, I mean, I weighed last week. We didn't, speak about this topic. We had other things to talk about, but I feel like that this is a big enough topic in our culture and in our church that we do need to discuss this intelligently, charitably.
And I've got to say, this is one of the reasons I have so loved following where Peter is, because you've had a number of people from all across the different spectrum of being Catholic or whatever aspects of the culture, and they will write in and they will always be so kind and intelligent, and articulate. And then to also have kind, intelligent, articulate bishops, slamming these same kinds of people online, not only creates confusion, it creates a sense of cultural, dysphoria of like, how are we supposed to act and live this out and function? So, sorry. But
and I mean,
always been wonderful with this.
Part of it is because we have really sought to follow Pope Francis's example on these issues. Pope Francis has been very clear on matters of morality, on matters of doctrine, of ideology. Catholic teaching is in areas of human sexuality and moral doctrine is what it is. I have heard from people who have spoken to Pope Francis, in fact, that he wants to uphold Catholic doctrine, but he wants to do as much as possible to be welcoming, inviting, charitable, understanding to LGBT people. And we've seen examples of this. We've seen, his friendship with Juan Carlos Cruz, a gay man, for example, who was a Chilean survivor of sexual abuse. He was one of the people actually that Pope Francis initially accused of slandering a bishop in Chile. And Pope Francis apologized, and Juan Carlos, who Jeannie Gaffigan and I interviewed last year for our podcast, he accepted the Pope's apology, and rather than be triumphalist or bitter, he offered his own services to the Pope. And I mean, he's a wealthy, well-off businessman. He's well-to-do, but deep down he has a Catholic heart. And so he's been helping with refugees in the Ukraine war. He just published an article about laws in Uganda that basically put the death penalty on the table for homosexuals. He's noted that the Ugandan bishops are absolutely silent on these issues. He's a member of the Pontifical Commission on the Protection of Minors. So he's actively working to help the church. And it was it was because of his openness, and it was because Pope Francis reached out to him and apologized and was genuinely sorry for thinking negatively of him. But you also see articles about how every month or two there's a group of transgender people that are brought by a sister who ministers to them, and they meet with Pope Francis, and he knows their names. He's seen pictures of their families. One of the women was either passed away or was too sick to come, and I think he blessed a picture. He's met with gay couples. I think it's, and we saw that video of him meeting with the young people, or the Spanish-speaking young people on Hulu. I think that the Catholic Church has a lot to atone for with the way they've treated LGBT people in the past. There's been a special stigma attached to people with these attractions or inclinations. They're marginalized in culture. And it is a double standard, because when it is, when it's a womanizer or, a woman who's been promiscuous or engaged in prostitution, it's like, as long as they are straight, they can get their lives back on track, get married in the church, and go with God. It's a lot more complicated for people whose orientations are different. And it is a struggle. And something that I've learned is that a lot of LGBT people are some of the most dedicated people to God, to faith, that searching, praying, works of charity. And so, yes, there are certain lines, like, for example, the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, being given an award at Dodger Stadium. That's a group of gay men dressed in drag as nuns. They have, in some cases, they have perverse names, sister, yada, yada, yada. And I think that, that kind of mockery is, isn't justifiable for anyone. But, there are certain levels of tolerance, especially with the way that we've treated people, the way the church has treated people in the past and made them feel alienated, that I think we don't have to fly into a blind rage if somebody has a pride flag on their Twitter handle or posted on their Facebook.
And that's what we've seen on, like, the Diocese of Pittsburgh canceling a pride mass on the campus of Duquesne University, and Catholics are supporting the pride movement. And so I'm curious in your take then, how, maybe not can Catholics support the pride movement? Maybe that's the question. Can we, or how can we, or is there just a level of there's nothing magisterial about this, and there's a lot of good and there's a lot of mistakes?
I would, there is no doctrine. If you go to the catechism and look about whether you can wear a rainbow flag because you have a certain because you have a certain sexual orientation or, a certain gender identity, there's no restriction against wearing a rainbow. And I think, sort of these repercussions of this intolerance and things that have driven people away from the church is the hostility, the hysteria that Catholics show at the slightest hint of, using the term LGBT or describing something as homophobia, or, maybe just having friends or inviting them over to your home or getting together for dinner without admonishing them every 5 minutes. We have to live in the society, even if we're not of the society. I mean, speaking for myself, my own personal morality is, in line with the Catholic Church, but I do things that aren't in line with the Catholic Church. That's sin, and it's sin as defined by the Catholic Church. Other people, their consciences may be different, or they struggle with the idea, or, they're not quite sure where they want to be, and they might not be living, the ideal lifestyle that some Catholics may imagine, but I don't think any of us do, really. It's not to downplay the gravity of sin. It's not to downplay, chastity in any way, shape, or form. We're all called to chastity.
Mm-hmm.
But this is, it just seems to me that emotions run high, judgmentalism runs high.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that, Father James Martin is treated as diabolical when you have other people who are, pretty much in schism being tolerated. You can cast a blind eye to E. Michael Jones's anti-Semitism, but you can't act like, Father Martin is a priest in good standing and a Jesuit in good standing. I mean, we all have to follow our consciences, but we should also have a certain level of detachment.
Right.
And that's, I think that's something that Pope Francis exhibits. He does. He's not easily offended.
Yeah. And what's beautiful, what he models as a pattern for how we should all go about it. And he's quite straightforward. When somebody wants to know what he thinks about something, he'll straight up and tell them. But other times he's always looking to affirm the personhood. And then there's that difference between tolerance and condonement. And he walks that path very, very carefully. I think a lot of us don't have a sense of that distinction, of that nuance.
Well, and that is the hardest thing. And I just want to say that maybe we should be a little bit more tolerant of each other when it comes to whether it's tolerance, condoning, just being welcoming or hospitable. I think we shouldn't jump to judgment. I mean, I know people have judged me. I've probably judged people in the past. People think I'm harboring some kind of secret agenda. And the fact of the matter is, I recognize that this is a very difficult topic. Mm-hmm. I'm conflicted every time it comes up, but I feel that it's my responsibility to dive headfirst into this mess, because that's what we're being called to do.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of that, we're going to next week come back to, we were going to do it this week, but it only just landed on Monday, so we haven't had time to sort of review it and discuss it. Mike hasn't, and his cadre of geniuses, the Vatican document on engagement with social media. So that was just released this past Monday. Next week, we plan to discuss the highlights of the document and what people in the church are saying about it. So be a good document for everyone to sink their teeth into before next week. But that directly affects half of the stuff that we're talking about today, and half of the reasons why things just go crazy on social media and in the church. So anyhow, Mike, thank you for the debrief. Available links to the topics are in the description for those who want to go a little more deeply into these things. The conversation is brought to you by smartcatholics.com, the free online community for millennials, creators, and learners. Join the private Where Peter Is group to ask questions, share insights, and maybe suggest topics for next time, things you'd like us to cover.
And visit wherepeteris.com to read articles, commentaries, and spiritual reflections by and for faithful Catholics who support the vision of Pope Francis.
Share this episode with family, friends, maybe followers. Hit the subscribe button so that you never miss an episode of the debrief from Where Peter Is.
Yeah, and please consider supporting Where Peter Is on Patreon. It'll help us continue running the site, bringing you this show. I just mentioned on Twitter, and Dominic and I were just talking about it, that May 2023 was the biggest month in the history of Where Peter Is in terms of traffic.
Wow.
We've sort of been running on, a shoestring, a prayer, and the talent and dedication of our volunteer contributors. So I don't know. Please consider. We need to discern the future of the site, and it's only going to be possible with support.
That's right. Your patronage to your friends directly creates the freedom Mike and his team need to be providing the service, which, as far as I can tell, doesn't exist anywhere else online in as coordinated and concentrated an effort. So do support them on Patreon. Thanks for joining us. When it comes to news and controversies in the Catholic Church, stay curious, informed, and engaged.